In the grand halls of American memory, names like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Paul Revere echo loudly. Their faces are carved into monuments, their stories retold in classrooms, their courage immortalized in film and books. Yet, hidden behind the thunder of these famous names, there lived men and women whose sacrifices were just as vital, yet far less remembered. Among them was Peter Salem, a man who began his life in bondage, and whose musket would one day echo across the battlefield in a shot that altered the course of the American Revolution. The American Revolution was not only a clash of armies, but also a clash of ideals. It was a war waged for freedom, yet not everyone in the colonies was free. Nearly 500,000 men, women, and children of African descent lived as enslaved people, deprived of the very liberty the revolutionaries claimed to be fighting for. But some of these men found themselves pulled into the storm, and among them stood Peter Salem. His story is one of contradictions, a man born enslaved, fighting in a war for liberty, a forgotten hero whose single act shifted the tide of one of the most important early battles, a patriot whose name was nearly erased from the very history he helped shape. His life asks us uncomfortable questions about freedom, memory, and justice, and offers us a rare glimpse of courage unchained. To understand the significance of Peter Salem's musket shot at the Battle of Bunker Hill, we must begin much earlier, in the shadow of slavery, where his journey to freedom first began. Peter Salem was born in 1750 in Framingham, Massachusetts, into a world that denied him ownership of his own life. His childhood was marked not by freedom or education, but by labor and subjugation. Like many enslaved Africans in New England, he grew up working the land, carrying burdens, and serving the household of his master, Jeremiah Belknap. Framingham was a small town, but like much of colonial America, it carried the contradictions of liberty and bondage side by side. On Sundays, townsfolk gathered to hear sermons about freedom and God's will, while outside the church walls enslaved men like Peter worked silently, invisible in their suffering. Yet, Peter was not without hope. By the 1770s, the winds of revolution began to stir across Massachusetts. The colonies were in uproar against British taxation and oppression. The talk of liberty spread from taverns to churches, from farms to city squares. Ironically, enslaved men and women like Peter heard these cries more sharply than anyone else. If liberty was truly the birthright of all men, then surely it must belong to them as well. In 1775, just as tensions erupted at Lexington and Concord, Peter's master made a decision that would change the course of his life. Jeremiah Belknap sold Peter Salem to Major Lawson Buckminster, a militia officer. Unlike Belknap, Buckminster saw something more in Peter. He recognized his skill, his strength, and perhaps his potential as a soldier. Buckminster granted Salem his freedom and encouraged him to join the colonial militia. For the first time in his life, Peter was no longer a possession. He was a man, and more than that, a soldier. His musket was no longer the tool of another man's will, but his own. And with it, he would step into history. The drums of war were beating. Boston Harbor bristled with British ships. The redcoats marched closer each day. And on a June morning in 1775, Peter Salem would march to the hill that would make his name immortal. June 17, 1775. The air above Boston was thick with smoke and tension. On the heights overlooking the city, colonial forces had hastily fortified Breed's Hill, preparing for an inevitable clash with a mighty British army. Though history calls it the Battle of Bunker Hill, the blood would spill on the slopes of Breed's Hill. Among the ranks of colonial soldiers stood Peter Salem. He was one of very few black men on the field that day, carrying his musket with steady determination. The colonial militia was outnumbered and undersupplied, but their spirit burned with a desire to prove that farmers and freedmen could stand against the greatest military force on earth. When the redcoats advanced, the Americans held their fire until the enemy was nearly upon them. The command echoed down the line, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Muskets thundered, smoke filled the air, and waves of British soldiers fell. Twice, the redcoats charged, and twice they were repelled. But on the third assault, the British surged with renewed ferocity. The colonial lines wavered. Ammunition was running low. And leading the charge for the British was Major John Pitcairn, a veteran officer who had commanded the redcoats at Lexington and Concord. His presence struck fear into the Americans, a symbol of British discipline and might. As Pitcairn rallied his men, urging them up the hill, a single musket shot cracked through the chaos. That shot came from Peter Salem's gun. Major Pitcairn fell. The British line faltered in shock. For a moment, the tide shifted, and though the colonists would eventually retreat for lack of ammunition, the battle had proved something vital. The British could bleed, and the colonists could fight them as equals. In the reports and whispers that followed, some remembered that a freed black soldier had fired the fateful shot. But others were quick to let his name fade. Peter Salem's act of courage became a ghost in history, overshadowed by the larger narrative of white generals and founding fathers. Yet on that hill, in that moment, his musket spoke louder than centuries of silence. Peter Salem did not lay down his weapon after Bunker Hill. Instead, he marched forward into the long and grueling struggle for independence. Unlike many militia men who served briefly before returning home, Salem committed himself to the cause for years. He fought at Concord, Saratoga, and Monmouth, battles where the very survival of the Revolution hung in the balance. Each battlefield carried its own horrors: the thunder of cannons, the cries of the wounded, the bitter cold of winter camps where hunger gnawed as fiercely as the enemy. Yet Salem endured it all, a freedman proving through courage that liberty was worth the cost. At Saratoga in 1777, he witnessed the turning point of the war, when British General Burgoyne surrendered to the Americans. At Monmouth in 1778, he stood under blistering heat as Washington's army clashed with the British in one of the war's fiercest engagements. Time and again, Salem showed his loyalty not just to men, but to an idea, that a new nation could rise where freedom was more than a slogan. But even as he fought for liberty, the irony was never lost on him. Many of his fellow black soldiers still lived in bondage. Others who had been promised freedom in exchange for service were betrayed by broken promises. Peter's musket may have won him respect among his brothers in arms, but in the eyes of the broader nation, his skin still kept him on the margins of remembrance. Still, Salem pressed forward, carrying both the flag of a newborn country and the unspoken hope that one day freedom would extend to all who lived upon its soil. When the guns finally fell silent and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the United States was born. For most soldiers, victory meant returning to their families, their farms, or new opportunities in a free republic. But for Peter Salem, life after the Revolution was not filled with honor or prosperity. He had given years of his life to the cause of independence, stood shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers, and played his part in battles that shaped a nation. Yet, when he returned home, there were no medals, no land grants, and little recognition. While generals and wealthy officers were immortalized in books and statues, Peter Salem lived quietly in Framingham, Massachusetts, eking out a humble living. Some accounts say he worked as a cane weaver. Others recall him doing odd jobs to survive. Unlike the founding fathers, he did not walk the halls of power. Unlike Washington or Jefferson, he left behind no estates or written legacy. Instead, he lived in the shadows of the very freedom he had fought to secure. Still, he carried with him the dignity of knowing he had helped shape history. His service could never be erased, even if the world refused to acknowledge it. Peter Salem eventually passed away in 1816, largely forgotten by the nation he had helped to build. He was buried in a poor man's grave, with no great monument to mark his contribution. And yet, the earth beneath which he lay was free, because he and countless others had fought for it. For decades, Peter Salem's name barely appeared in the histories of the Revolution. His shot at Bunker Hill was remembered, but not always attributed to him. His years of service were known to comrades, but omitted from grand speeches about liberty. It was only much later, As historians began to search for the contributions of African Americans in the Revolution, that Salem's story returned from silence. Today, his courage at Bunker Hill is honored in museums, and his name is spoken with respect among those who seek to tell the whole story of America's founding. A freed black man, once enslaved, who carried a musket into battle and struck down one of Britain's most feared officers. Peter Salem's life reminds us that history is often written by those in power, but true heroism lives in the overlooked and the forgotten. His legacy is not just about a single musket shot, it is about the principle that freedom must be fought for by all and must belong to all. In the echoes of muskets on Breed's Hill, in the silent determination of a soldier who expected little in return, Peter Salem stands eternal. A hidden hero, finally stepping back into the light of remembrance.